Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Graduate Student Mental Health, Putting the Toolkit into Practice. This webinar aims to take a meaningful approach to offering guidance on how to support graduate students from all walks of life, and the suggestions provided are meant to enhance campus experiences for both graduate students and programs moving forward. My name is Chris Pankowich, and I'm the Research and Knowledge Lead here at the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. I'll be acting as your moderator today and will be, as best I can, trying to keep track of all the questions and comments throughout the chat and Q&A as the session is occurring. Before we do get started, I would like to share a brief land acknowledgement that was originally the closing prayer by Okanagan Nation Elder Grouse Barnes at the 2015 International Conference on Health Promoting Universities and Colleges. This land does not belong to us. This land belongs to 7 generations down the road. I pray the water that we drink, the water that we swim in, will be there for our great, great, great grandchildren, as well as all over the world. I pray that the land we walk on, the trees that we enjoy, will be there for generations to come. These things, they all come together with health, health of humans, health of the animals, and health of Mother Earth. I would also now like to provide a brief introduction to our presenters today. We are being joined by Perlin Ng, a current Master's of Management graduate student with an extensive background in health promotion. We also have Kirthana Ilankiran, who is a current Master of Social Work graduate student focusing on human services management and leadership. And we also have Melanie Ann Atkins, who is the Acting Associate Director of Graduate Programs at Western University's Center for Teaching and Learning. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before we begin. Our presenters will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so I would like to draw your attention to the bottom of your screen, and you might need to just move your cursor over the area. You will see both a Q&A and a chat feature there, so please use the Q&A feature to submit formal questions for the presenters. We will try to get to as many of these questions as possible at the end of the session. For all other inquiries or comments, please use the chat feature. We encourage you to use this to stay connected with each other and share thoughts and perspectives as the presentation is occurring. A brief follow-up survey, feedback survey that is, will be sent out to you via email after the session, and it will be greatly appreciated if you can fill that out. So that was my little spiel. So I'm going to pass it along to Perlin to kick us off for today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. That always takes a couple of seconds to finagle. Let's see. Okay. Hopefully that's showing up for everyone. And of course, feel free to type in the chat or give me a shout out, say, hey, Perlin, we can't see your screen. But hello, everyone, and really nice to see people dialing into this really important conversation about graduate student mental health. I do see a couple of familiar names in the participant window, and for those of you who may actually somewhat recognize me, I used to work with CICMH, but now I am a graduate student. So thanks CICMH for inviting me back to kind of speak about graduate student mental health. One of the things I'm going to ask people to do actually is if you're able to kind of just type in the chat where you're from, what's your institution and whether you're a student or perhaps you are, working with students, you're a graduate student advisor, you're in student services. We kind of love to see where people are coming from. And now in the meantime, I'm going to kind of proceed with the presentation. I don't have too much slides here, but the first part of it in what I wanted to get into is actually to give a really quick overview of the graduate student mental health toolkit that's on the CICMH website, which I was one of the authors, and we also there was also a advisory committee and a review committee from various people in Ontario at colleges and universities who provide a lot of really helpful advice, feedback, critiques, the content. So it was definitely a collaborative effort. And there's a lot of really great stuff in the toolkit that I want to just give an overview of. So You can access the toolkit on our say our website. I'm not CICMH anymore, so I can't say our website, but on the CICMH website, it's at campusmentalhealth.ca, and then you go to toolkits, and then it's graduate student mental health. So, in a nutshell, as Chris mentioned, the toolkit is about how do you support graduate students. And we kind of define graduate students here as anyone who is in a master's program, PhD program, or maybe it's different kinds of professional programs like, law degree, medical degree, anything that is sort of post the undergrad level. And this toolkit is meant for um, all levels of campus staff, whether it's student services, faculty, counseling departments, etc. Oh, and I'm seeing the chat kind of slowly populating with people from various places. It's great. We've got people from all over Ontario, we've got Windsor, U of T, Wilfrid Laurier, Lakehead. Awesome. Really great to see all of you. Okay. So yeah, I really encourage you to check out the toolkit in your own time, because what I'm going to do here is just give like a really brief snapshot so that you have an idea about the content. One of the first things that I want to talk about is, how do graduate students differ from undergraduate students, and why do we need to talk about graduate student mental health in particular? Can't it just be student mental health? Well, there's a couple of differences that might exist between graduate students and undergraduate students. And this is all, speaking on a very general level. It's not going to be true for every single graduate student or every single undergraduate student, but on average, these are some of the differences that we might see. So, according to the National Graduate Survey, and this was back in 2015, there isn't a more recent one. The median age of undergraduate students when they finish their degrees is 23, while if you're talking about the master's and doctoral level, it's 28 and 32 respectively. So there's quite a big difference in age as expected, because graduate school comes after undergrad. Um, this means that there are substantial differences in the sort of life stages that grad students on average might be at compared to undergrad students. One of the other things that can be really different is in that same survey, they also found that the average debt, and this is in Canadian dollars, the average debt owed upon graduation for undergrads is about 15,000. And then at the master's level was almost double at 28,000. At the doctoral level was 33,000. So they're taking on almost double the amount of debt when they graduate from their graduate degrees. Um, Another thing that could be quite different comparing grad students to undergrad students are things like marital status or family status. So, not surprisingly, according to a report from McGill University, there are very few undergrad students, about 3% that reported being either married or living with a common law partner. And of course, these proportions increase at the master's level. And I believe the numbers were about 16% at the master's level, and 30% at the doctoral level. So again, because of that different age ranges that you tend to see in graduate versus undergrad, students can come from very different sort of family backgrounds. At the graduate level, oftentimes you're going to get more mature students who may already have kids, may have families, and that type of thing, which is not to say that you never see that in undergrads, which is actually becoming more and more common these days. But as things are right now, you're still seeing that happen more at the graduate level. Another point that I want to make is differences in, citizenship, or citizenship status or nationality. There's quite a high level of variation that exists among the different universities or different colleges in terms of student demographics, and most of this is, of course, as maybe a result of the types of programs being offered or the geographic location where the institution is. So to kind of take a example of two large universities in Toronto, just to kind of compare geographically. So Ryerson University, which is where I'm at right now, has about 5.9% international students at the undergraduate level, and then 16% at the graduate level. But if you look at U of T, and this was a report from a couple of years ago, so I'm sure the numbers are a little bit different now. U of T had 22% international students at the undergrad level and then 16.8 at the graduate level. So kind of like a flipped relationship. Ryerson has way more international students at the graduate level. So depending on your institution, these numbers could be very different. One of the last things I want to address in terms of how graduate students can be really different from undergraduate students is the sort of ambiguous staff student status that a lot of students have. And this perhaps is a little bit more relevant for programs that are sort of research based, thesis based, degrees as opposed to more kind of applied professional degrees, because in these kinds of research and thesis based master's slash PhD, oftentimes you'll have grad students who also serve as teaching assistants, who also serve as research assistants for the professor. So they sort of like straddle the fine line between their students and institution, but they're also employed staff there. So as a result, they might find them, graduate students may find themselves straddling that boundary and can find themselves in the unique position sometimes of socializing with some of the undergrad peers while also struggling to maintain those professional boundaries as campus staff. And that's something that I'm going to get into a little bit in kind of the second part of my presentation near the end. But I find that that's one of the really interesting key differences there. Um, so a couple of things that are here's a couple of like unique factors that affect mental health at the graduate level, and some of it is absolutely pertinent at the undergrad level as well. So first thing I want to talk about is schoolwork, and this is both in volume and in structure, because oftentimes in grad school it's depending on the program, again, because we can only ever speak in general terms. Oftentimes the volume of work at the graduate level is a lot higher and it's a lot more self-directed than undergrad. The second thing is finances, which is a huge concern for a lot of students, whether it's at the undergrad level or the graduate level, because uh, one of the reasons being that a much higher level of debt that we've talked about on the last slide. Graduate and teaching assistantships can often take up a lot of time for grad students. Again, this is more related to those sort of like thesis based programs. Career planning is something that's on a lot of people's minds when they're going back into graduate school. Usually, a lot of students who decide to go back to pursue a graduate education, they're doing so because they're planning to, this is like the next step of my career. So it's very much on the forefront of their mind. So that can cause a lot of anxiety, a lot of stressors with that kind of ambiguity. Family issues and relationships, and one example is sort of the two body problem. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this concept, where oftentimes if you're in graduate school and then maybe your partner is also in graduate school, it's very unlikely that you're going to end up going to the same institutions. There's often once you get accepted into a program, you might have to move. That might cause like family separate, like not separation as in divorce, but physical separation where somebody might have to move. So there's a lot of like these family relationship issues that might arise as well. And finally, one of the things I want to highlight is super, super important. Actually, one of the key determining factors for grad students who do work on research is their relationships with their thesis advisors or the principal investigators, depending on kind of different universities have a different term for that. And these advisors play a huge role in sort of that both informal and formal support actually for their students. And again, this is something I'm going to get into a little bit later. Okay. Why are my slides not changing? Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I know that in Melanie Ann's section, she's going to go into some really awesome kind of concrete examples of how these play out. But in the toolkit, we provide some examples for, some recommendations for different types of program and policy considerations. And these are just some of the examples. I'm not going to read out all of them, but things like flexible counseling hours, comprehensive training of kind of what specific issues graduate students face, um, and tailoring services to students at different stages of their program, because a student who's in year one of their PhD is quite different from somebody who is maybe ready to defend or after they've defended, and things like that. All right. And finally, I just want to kind of highlight with the sort of environment that we're in right now, this brave new COVID world. There's a lot of different considerations that we'd have to bear in mind for designing supports at the graduate level. And the first one is increased flexibility, not just in mental health supports, but in sort of the program itself, especially with, and I keep talking about thesis-based masters because that's what I'm familiar with. So this might not may apply differently to other kinds of graduate degrees. So things like research activities have been severely impacted by COVID-19, especially for the fields where you're doing wet work or lab work or in-person data collection. All these kinds of things, they've come to a complete standstill. I know that for journal publications, the review process has become super long right now, and just in sort of that, the research clock has really sort of stalled right now. So when we talk about increased flexibility, it's sort of the understanding that's being provided to students that it's not, we're not living in normal times, and it's okay that if you need to take a little bit longer to complete your degrees, to complete your research, and maybe your funding won't be affected, because a lot of students are concerned about how their funding and their scholarships might be affected. um, Similar to that is also kind of addressing the different types of inequity challenges that come with suddenly being thrown into this online slash like hybridized degree, and how students from sort of different backgrounds will be disrupted in their careers because of this. And this is, I guess, just something that supervisory committees, institutional units that administer scholarships would bear in mind. Hybrid course delivery. Don't need to go to, oops, I accidentally skipped to the next slide. Hybrid course delivery is something that a lot of people are exploring right now. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, except for same things that we've talked about, kind of just bearing in mind the different places where students are coming from and why equity can be a concern. In fact, I'm gonna kind of throw out a really great other toolkit that CICMH produced, which is Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Toolkit, which is up on the CICMH website. That's really worth checking out to really inform that sort of work. And final point that goes without saying is the increased formal and informal supports that a lot of students will be needing at this time. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Melanie Ann.
Great. Thank you for setting that up so nicely, Perlin. And I will always think of you as still part of CICMH. All right, so I'm going to now get ready to share my screen. All right, and we're off. Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Melanie Ann Atkins, and I am going to be talking about 3 concrete examples of how you might think about implementing all of the, well, not all, many of the recommendations that Perlin just talked about that are available in the toolkit. So a little bit about me. So I'm currently the Acting Associate Director of Graduate Programs at Western University Center for Teaching and Learning. And my background is from Western University, and it really looks like this today. Like it actually looks like this. So it's a beautiful day, both in my imaginary world on Zoom, but also in the real outdoors. Anyway, but my first full-time job at Western University was a 3-year contract position called the Wellness Coordinator, where among other duties, I was hired to oversee the opening and development of the Wellness Education Center that you see here. So this picture is of me and some of my student staff members after our last staff meeting before I moved on to another role in the university. So over the 2.5 years, this is like an overview of some of the things that I did, because one of my duties in that role was to develop wellness alliances and outreach in the Western community and beyond. So last year at the CICMH conference, I talked about some of these. And so during the next 10 minutes today, I'm going to focus on examples from the grad student and the faculty bubbles you see here. So one disclaimer, very important, I am a clinician, my PhD is in education. And so all of the examples about how you could implement the recommendations in the toolkit will focus on mental health literacy rather than counseling. But I think this is an exciting opportunity, because sometimes when we think about mental health, we actually only or predominantly think about it from a position of, what can we do in counseling? So I'm going to talk about other things besides counseling today. All right. So here are my 3 toolkit examples, implementation examples that I am going to go into this 10 minutes. Okay, so the first one was a role for graduate students only called Wellness Education Center Ambassadors. And I just think this is interesting. So first of all, I'll tell you which recommendations in the toolkit it responds to. So it responds to the recommendations about a private and separated space for graduate student counseling services, which I'll get into in a bit. Good story there. Comprehensive training of graduate specific issues, and building graduate student issues into a campus-wide mental health initiative. And so here you see that my point here is that I said that it was a response to help seeking stigma. So the way that the Wellness Education's physical location was set up was that it was in the basement of a high traffic area in the University Community Center at Western. And we had one solid wall and one glass wall, right? And it was student run, and many of the students who ran the center were undergraduate students. And so there's a lot of stigma around seeking help. And I know that in my own experience as a graduate student at Western, I really didn't want anybody to know that I was seeking help, because I also faced stigma too. And so I understood that some graduate students didn't want to be seen coming to the center, and we're also nervous, what if the person who's working at the front desk is actually my student and I'm now telling them about my mental health needs and concerns. And so we actually couldn't change the space, so that we changed the program instead. So that's why I say that it actually was a different kind of response than you might think to an ask, like a separated space, if that's what you can't actually have at that time. Now, there have been changes. The place behind me in my Zoom background is actually Middlesex College, and that is the new location of the Society of Graduate Students, and they've got some great private space for graduate students to be served. But at the time, we didn't have that. Okay, so so the way that we had it is that we had at least one of these ambassadors from each faculty. We have 12 faculties, and it was really important that we got the nomenclature right. So we couldn't call ourselves Wellness Ambassador. We also correct them, say, no, not Wellness Ambassador, Wellness Education Center Ambassador, because we really wanted to emphasize that we were not doing or training these Wellness Education Center ambassadors as graduate students to be counselors. Instead, we were focused on mental health literacy, resource knowledge, system navigation, and referral. And so what I did with these graduate students, and who all just volunteered to be part of it because they were just so excited to be a part of this movement of mental health literacy at Western, was I gave them similar training to what my wellness peer educators who worked at the Wellness Education Center got, as well as some of the elements of a program called Leadership Education Program that I also designed for undergraduates. But then what I did is I added graduate student and graduate school specific references throughout the training. And we talked about imposter syndrome a lot more, and relationships with the supervisor and those kinds of things as well. So the second one I want to talk about today is graduate student specific programming. So in addition to the toolkit recommendations I mentioned on the last slide, this idea also responds to recommendations to extend partnerships with campus career centers and to offer increased flexibility and hybrid delivery in light of COVID-19. So here you see an advertisement just for a few days ago for an Own Your Future workshop, which is Western University's School of Graduate and Postdoctoral Scholars Professional Development Program for doctoral students. So this program is based on 6 core competencies, including career engagement, like you see here, as well as thriving, which includes time management, practicing work-life balance, self-care, and help seeking. So for the thriving competency, I developed 2 workshops a few years ago, which I'm going to teach again in January coming up, called Thriving in Graduate School and Stress Management for Doctoral Students. So in addition to Own Your Future, I also received permission from Ryerson University to redevelop their very successful 11-week Thriving in Action program for all students into a program just for Western graduate students, because I remember going to that training for Thriving in Action, and as soon as I saw what was going on there, I thought, I need to bring this to Western for graduate students because it really responds to so many things that graduate students are always telling me they want more of. And so each week, Thriving in Action teaches students 2 thriving skills, one focused on holistic wellness and one focused on academics. So what I did was to redevelop the material to focus solely on graduate student issues with a graduate student named Ghazal Kukreja. And we took turns teaching the content. And then the next year, another graduate student named Kayla Edwards took over teaching the program to her fellow graduate students. Next was the TA e-learning series. So this was developed just a few months ago by a team of subject matter experts at the Center for Teaching and Learning, including graduate students who are TA training program instructors. So I was responsible for the module called Humanizing Your Virtual Classroom, which included opportunities for graduate students to learn how to develop and sustain a mentally healthy online classroom that goes both ways, right? So not only are you humanizing your students, but they are seeing the human behind the screen too, so that you really make those connections that can be strained or different in the online environment, and also to learn how to address inequity challenges in the online learning environment. And finally, the Future Prof workshops that I talk about here on this slide, they included leadership and wellness training, which I'll talk about in the next slide, as well as a workshop about stress management for TA specifically. And again, yes, there was more talk about imposter syndrome and also procrastination and some positive psychology things about using optimism as a strategy, not a lifestyle, just strategy. All right, so the third idea for implementation of the recommendations from the toolkit is about faculty workshops. And so after COVID-19 changed the way we worked at the Center for Teaching and Learning, I also led the development of the center's faculty mentor program workshops, including a new workshop I developed with a graduate student named Nicole Feiss, and returning to a previous curriculum project I worked on when I was with Student Experience in 2018 called Leadership and Wellness, a strengths-based approach. So the next 6 slides are PowerPoint slides from these workshops, so you can get a sense of the learning outcomes for each workshop. All right, let's start with leadership and wellness. So this slide allows faculty to learn how to challenge misconceptions about mental health and mental illness. And you can see how we adapted this activity to the online environment where we teach it on Zoom and then we say, use the chat to correct each statement. So this activity helps graduate student supervisors understand how to bring a strengths-based approach to their understanding of mental health and mental illness, and to correct stigmatizing beliefs about mental health and mental illness that may be quite prominent in the academy. Second sample slide. So every time I present this slide, both graduate students and faculty tell me how much this opens their eyes to negative coping strategies they use because they're often approved or even encouraged in academia. They often comment that increasing their mental health literacy in this way compelled them to want to make changes to the coping strategies they use and encourage fellow graduate students to use to support their success in the academy. So a lot of reflection going on here when they realize, oh yes, the academy actually often talks about coping strategies, just the negative ones. And why is that? And how can we change that, right? So then we go from that individual, interpersonal change to systemic and institutional culture change, which is pretty exciting. So this slide comes after we give them statistics about the increasing number of students at Western who access mental health support and identify as having a mental illness. So again, this gives faculty an opportunity to challenge stigmatizing misconceptions about the reasons for the increase in these numbers. So with each of the 3 determinants you see here, we help faculty understand how they can respond to each of these in their teaching and their classrooms, virtual or otherwise. And the last slide from Leadership and Wellness. So one way our program is unique is the way that we compose the case studies that faculty are asked to respond to. I wanted to use the case studies to build on the determinants in mental health you saw on the last slide to add real context to each student's story rather than the classic, Sally is having a panic attack, what do you do? Or Bob is depressed, what should you say? So this was based on feedback from faculty that previous trainings they attended didn't seem to prepare them in the moment to help a real live student because of the complexity of real situations. When a student needed help, made them actually feel paralyzed with indecision about what to do because it didn't seem to line up with the case studies they had practiced during previous mental health literacy training. So I worked with a graduate student named Erin Anderson to develop intentionally complex case studies. So time after time, faculty comment on how grateful they are for the opportunity to really wrestle with these issues during the training so that they're more prepared to help struggling students in their academic roles. So in this case, Jamie is an international student who uses they, them pronouns. They struggle with isolation and marginalization in the first semester. Then they experience a panic attack in the second semester. Sabra, you see here, is a Black student on the Graduate Student Council who experiences sexual violence on campus, but is reluctant to seek support from that same campus community. And again, faculty are tasked to respond and design new strategies to reach students like Jamie and Sabra, who may be more reluctant to seek help, and think about those root causes, why that might be. And again, so here we're bringing in the systemic issues as well, rather than just keeping it at the interpersonal level. And then finally, you see here Alvaro, who is a first-generation student who works 12-hour weekend shifts to help contribute to his family. After he breaks his leg and starts withdrawing from friends and activities, faculty here are challenged to initiate a mental health conversation with a student who, on the surface, is only experiencing a physical challenge because of his broken leg. And so there's some great conversations that we get into about, well, if the issue is technically a physical health thing, is it appropriate to talk about mental health? And how can I broach that with somebody who may not be ready for that conversation? So those are the kinds of things we talk about in that training. So the other workshop I developed this summer is again from the Faculty Mentor Program, and it's called the Teaching Sensitive Topics, a Trauma and Violence Informed Approach. So this is the one that I developed with graduate student Nicole Feist. Thanks, Nicole, this is great. So again, we use case studies of what seems on the surface to be inexplicable or illogical student behaviors to examine each principle of trauma and violence informed care. And then we discuss how faculty can respond. And then what's happened since then, this workshop was really popular. I ran it 5 times, and I have, now there's an educational developer and e-learning specialist, Sean, who works at the Center for Teaching and Learning, and he actually developed, took this topic of trauma informed pedagogy and took it to the next level, combined it with factors that have really been affecting students since COVID, as including, like he went all the way, including topics about anti-racism as well. And he has done an asynchronous learning module for faculty so that they can access this information and learn how to respond at any time, not just coming to a workshop. And then the final one I want to show you from the sample is this slide, because I use this slide to promote psychological safety for both faculty and their students by having faculty model it and by tying it to the essential qualities of post-secondary instructors who are guided by ethical principles and professionalism. So here it's really important, right? Because sometimes, you might have faculty who say, this has nothing to do with my role, and like, this is outside the bounds. But here, when you tie it to ethics and professionalism, we can get a really good response. And the last thing I want to say is that finally, Western, not me, but Western has produced a number of guides that actually help faculty support their students using mentally healthy and culturally sensitive approaches to mentoring and supervision. All right, I'll end it there and I'll pass it over to our next presenter.
Thank you, Melanie Ann. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Sorry. Oh, okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Kirtana Ilan-Kiran, and I'm a Master's of Social Work student. I'm going to be talking a little bit about graduate student mental health, specifically as it relates to applied disciplines, and specifically within my experiences of the MSW program. Although I think a lot of these themes are very generalizable to helping professions and human services programs as a whole. So just to start off, I'm going to be talking about the applied nature of the MSW program. So since it is an applied program, it integrates academic knowledge with hands-on experience. So the placement is a big component of the MSW program. And so the way that it's structured is that we have 2 placements throughout our 2 years. And usually we have 2 to 3 days of classes and 3 days of placements. And so some of the kind of challenges that this placement and the structures kind of have on students is that it's difficult to manage a work-life balance when you have 2 to 3 days of school and 2 to 3 days of placement, and then you have assignments and readings to kind of do on top of that. And this is kind of this kind of work-life balance is made even harder when you take into consideration that these placements are unpaid. So as Perlin mentioned earlier, a lot of grad students have a significant amount of debt. They have financial constraints because a lot of them are parents. They have other kind of financial responsibilities. So that adds to an additional level of stress. And some students, including myself, have had to take on a job on top of placement in school. And so I think this is also an important equity issue in the way that some students are afforded to be able to not take on a job and just do unpaid placements, and some students are not. And this unpaid nature of the placement also contributes to this kind of weird stress that students experience in not knowing some of the boundaries between being a student and a professional. So you're kind of treated like a student, but you're also doing very professional level work. You're taking on caseloads, you're seeing clients. So this kind of uncertainty of where you're placed in organizations and kind of where your value is as a student or staff in training or professional can also create additional stress for students. Aside from that, usually most programs are the terminal practice degree. So afterwards, we're kind of going directly into the workforce. So there are worries about career prospects. And I think some of the differences between research programs are that you don't have the kind of advisor support, the ongoing support and guidance you get from an advisor. So oftentimes you're navigating career planning by yourself. And when you do kind of reach out to kind of build those connections with faculty to gain those kind of guidances, it's usually through volunteering and research assistantships and having to kind of put in like additional work on top of all of this to kind of get some guidance. Some of the things that are kind of specific to human services programs and specifically the MSW is that I find that there's sometimes not enough discussion around personal mental health. We talk about clients' mental health a lot, but not ourselves. So in the MSW program, we really prioritize self-reflexivity, which is super important when you're working with marginalized populations. And so we're told to lean into our discomfort, and that is reflecting on our social location, our privileges, our experiences of oppression. But I don't think there is much guidance on how to kind of manage these difficult emotions when they come up. And more generally, like I mentioned, not much space for personal mental health discussions. We have assignments that focus on self-reflexivity, but not so much self-care, and to ensure that we're actually kind of practicing what we preach to our clients and we're helping others, but how do we also help ourselves? And I think sometimes this could lead to self-stigma among helping professionals, in which ways, like, you feel feelings of inadequacy, or just like it's kind of a taboo subject, the fear of like disclosing mental health issues and things like that, just because the larger culture of it doesn't have much space for those discussions. So some considerations in the context of COVID-19 that like some of my peers and I have talked about is that some of the challenges that students are facing is that restricted access to faculty and field instructors, which is largely due to remote placement and remote learning activities. And I think this is especially kind of difficult for students who are doing direct placements and are working directly with clients. They're not having the opportunity to kind of debrief as frequently or as needed. Also, we're kind of in the MSW program, a lot of the sectors you're working are in kind of helping sectors in child welfare and mental health, and you're exposed to a lot of inequities and kind of difficult stories. And so it becomes even more important to have that frequent access and connection with your field instructors. But also field instructors are very overwhelmed right now. They're managing multiple students, they're managing their own clients. So I think everyone's kind of struggling with this right now. And also a lot of my peers have mentioned a lack of interaction with each other has kind of been difficult, especially in an applied program where you don't have the ongoing support of advisors. Having peers to help navigate this system is really helpful. So that's been a little bit isolating as well. And so I'm no expert, so I'm just going to suggest some applicable considerations framed around the ones that are mentioned in the toolkit. So as mentioned, like making graduate and student issues into a campus-wide initiative is super important. Having that continuous dialogue about mental health increases knowledge, reduces stigma. I think also just integrating self-care into the curriculum would be super helpful. Just we have self-reflexivity assignments, and so I think it's pretty easy to kind of include self-care into that, because when it becomes an optional kind of thing for students, I think there's a lot more different things that they would prioritize themselves. Additionally, having some comprehensive training of graduate specific issues. So as the toolkit mentioned, having a campus counselor available exclusive to graduate student issues who are familiar with some of their unique challenges. And in the context of the MSW program, that might be having a counselor who has training in vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, and kind of overall, I think, as the toolkit mentions, equity, anti-oppression, and anti-stigma training for all staff, especially when you're working with a diverse student population. I think it's important to have staff be culturally aware in how to best kind of connect with students and fostering a safer environment for students of color as a whole through that. And some kind of COVID considerations, I think, facilitating peer-to-peer information sharing. That's one of the things that was mentioned in the toolkit, and that's one of the things that I'm seeing in my cohort. There's a lot of peer groups being created for different assignments, different classes, different experiences, because a lot of students are finding it very challenging right now. So one of the things that, one of the groups that were created was a group for students in counseling practicums to kind of support each other, because they are not receiving the support they need from their agency. So I think campuses could also help facilitate this by creating these groups, but also maybe having a faculty member who focuses on clinical work, kind of being there as a support that students can go to. And I think this would be helpful in kind of alleviating some of the pressures on the agency as well. And another thing with COVID is that we've had a lot of flexibility with our placement requirements, and I think that's been super helpful. Things such as doing a reduced number of hours has been really great in terms of like stress, and having flexible options to have a hybrid model, so we can do in person and remote. And I think this kind of speaks to accessibility as a overall. I think that's really important. And right now, for the first time, I think students are allowed to do paid placements. And I think that's been really great. And I think some of these are kind of things that COVID has forced into place, but they have really good reason to kind of continue these long term, to just kind of navigate these stressors of grad school. And I think coming back to these paid placements, I think it's kind of outside campus jurisdiction maybe, and maybe these are just larger conversations that we should have with ministries and different colleges of social work and things like that. But starting to advocate and negotiating for paid placements for applied disciplines, I think it's super important. I think it will help alleviate financial burden, but also kind of help in trying to solidify a student's kind of role as a staff in training and feeling more valued in their day-to-day placements. And I think all these considerations kind of reiterate what the toolkit emphasizes, and it's that it's a whole campus approach. It's not the field instructors' kind of responsibility to take care of student health. Isn't the students themselves. It isn't the faculty. I think everyone has to kind of come together. And yeah, and that's my presentation. Thank you. I'm going to give it back to Perlin.
Thanks, Kirtana. I liked your last point about, how mental health is really an all-campus approach. It's not just like a staff thing or student thing. It's kind of just everybody on campus. Okay, gonna do that thing where there's always that slight pause while I'm waiting to share my screen. Awesome. So I'm gonna kind of shift gears a little bit because just now you guys heard from me while I was still kind of wearing my CICMH hat, which is now retired. But now I'm gonna kind of speak about things from a graduate student's perspective. So talking about where I'm at now. So I am currently at Ryerson and I'm doing a MSc in management at the Ted Rogers School of Management. And so kind of just in the last maybe 5-10 minutes before we open up for questions, I'm just gonna do similar to what Kitana did and share a little bit about my experiences as a graduate student and then kind of like, what's worked and like where what are the things that have been going super well and also like what are the things that I noticed that I needed more support on. So okay, and my slides are a lot less structured than Kitana's like awesome, lovely, really organized slides. So bear with me for a bit. They're kind of just chunked into one big cluster. So kind of just really informally, these are some things that really worked for me and I found to be really valuable in my kind of graduate student experience. And right at the top of the list, and I strongly believe that this is, if not the most important factor in graduate student wellness, then it's right up, it's up there, which was having a really incredible faculty supervisor. So my supervisor is my thesis advisor, and also having some really amazing faculty mentors. So that's something that we got into a little bit in the toolkit as well, but just having your thesis advisor or your PI, whatever, is going to be usually as a graduate student the person that you're working the most closely with. Like they're the ones who are there for you when throughout your degree. And I've had some really amazing conversations of my own thesis supervisor. And I'm just, one of the things that comes to mind is like a couple of weeks ago, I was in this sort of crisis mode and having a little bit of self-doubt on, is my thesis actually interesting? Is the research that I'm doing valid? Like, what am I doing with my life? And I just went to my my supervisor and I said, like, is it okay if I talk about this? And she was so open, she was so supportive and so kind of welcoming. She's like, of course, this is what I'm here for. I'm here to support you. And I went into that meeting feeling, well, really crappy, and then came out of that feeling like, okay, I'm ready to take on the world again. So I cannot underscore enough how much having supportive supervisors and having supervisors who understand like how to build great relationships with their advisees, I guess that's the word, advisees or mentees, all that, how important that is to the whole graduate experience, particularly in these kinds of research based programs. Second thing that was really helpful was that my program has a peer mentorship program where they pair students in the first year of their degrees with their master's degrees with students who are in their second year. And that was again something that was really helpful because I got to get a little bit of further view of like this is where in your second year people what people are doing. These are people who have gone through the process, who know what it's like, and have just being able to connect with some of these more sort of senior graduate students was so helpful for building expectations of what the program is going to be like, what my life is going to be like, and also just knowing that I'm not alone. um, Another thing is, so my program has these virtual office hours that we can just drop in every Monday, where we can just come in and chat with the program director and the program coordinator. And this is super helpful because in the kind of online Zoom university environment, it's really hard to have meaningful connections and to have like that sort of informal chats where usually if this was in person you would just drop by someone's office and be like, hey, how are you doing, it's great to kind of see you. So what my program did was they tried to recreate that as much as possible. They set up these virtual office hours, open invite to everyone in the program, and whether or not people drop in, they're going to be there and you can come in, chat about anything. You don't have to have a specific question. You can just talk about the weather, you can talk about the US elections, you can talk about anything you want. So that was really nice and really helped to get at the meaningful connection and social isolation piece. Fourth thing, I want to give a shout out to our graduate career center. So in my program, we have a graduate career center that is specific to my program. So it's not specific across all the graduate programs. It's specific to the TRSM department. And the people at the career center are really actively involved with the development of the kind of grad students in the program. So during orientation, they came in and talked to us, and throughout that, I get emails every now and then to kind of just follow up. That's saying like, hey, let us know if you want any support. Like, here are some resources, all that. And one of the reasons why I found this really helpful is kind of going back to that piece again earlier, where finances, careers are really on the top of my mind. In a way that they weren't when I was in undergrad. Not that I'm saying that all grad students are the same, but very much now, like it's super salient, the top of my mind, being like, okay, what are my next steps after I move on from university? And that sort of that financial career uncertainty actually weighs really heavily on my mind. So having that high level of involvement from our career centers makes me feel that, oh, these people have my back. If whatever I want, I can, whenever I want, I can make an appointment with someone to just kind of chat. And so I found that to be super helpful. Another thing that my program did was having this virtual week-long orientation, and that was awesome because usually I think when it was in person, they would chunk it all into one day, but I think the Zoom fatigue that would have resulted from that would have been actually quite bad. So what they did was they actually did a virtual week-long orientation. They had different events on different days, different faculty coming in, and that I feel really again helped to build a amazing sense of community, because it felt like I was kind of checking into a sort of like virtual lounge, virtual area, like every single day during that week, and kind of set up these sort of trends maybe for the rest of the semester. Because one of the things that happened during that week-long orientation was a lot of the grad students, like we set up in informal like WhatsApp groups or like Facebook groups, so that we had a way to connect with each other. Which brings me to my next point about the informal and social group supports and events. And again, cannot stress how kind of crucial they are right now, because it's if it wasn't for the fact that I had a connection to my cohort and I had friends that I could talk to, I think that this would be a lot more isolating and a lot more difficult. So the last thing I want to mention here, which I really appreciated from sort of everyone, whether it was students, staff, faculty, was just this recognition that things are difficult right now and nobody's kind of skirting around the issue. No one is pretending that things are okay. There's this overall amazing understanding that it's not business as usual. Things are difficult right now and it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to struggle. It's okay to not feel like you're at your best 100% of the time. So it was just this recognition that um it's a tough year, and that was something that I really valued. I also want to talk about maybe some of the challenges that I faced during this time, which a lot of it is a little bit more tied to things being online. Unfortunately, I don't really have a comparison as to what grad school is like when it's in person, so I can only speak assuming that these might be specific to COVID related challenges. So my right at the top of my list actually in what I struggled the most with is supporting my undergrads. So I'm a TA for a first year university course where I lead a small seminar group that kind of meets every 2 weeks. So I lead discussions, I lead the discussions in the tutorial groups. I grade them. There's a lot of things. I'm pretty involved with my undergrads. I know there's different kinds of TAs. Some TAs only grade, some TAs only like have office hours, but it was specific to sort of what I'm doing. I'm quite involved with my students. And one of the kind of top challenges that I have is knowing how to support my undergrad. So of course my university has all kinds of resources and things that I've inserted into my slides, and how, and of course we have things like there's the Ryerson version of the more feet on the ground training about how do you respond, recognize, respond, refer to students in crisis. But I often find myself kind of questioning, like, how do I do more? How do I support them more? I know there's so much ambiguity, there's so much anxiety, I know everyone is struggling. How can I, what do I do? What do I do as a TA? How can I support my undergrads more? So that's something that I've personally found to be really challenging. So I think that what Melanie Ann mentioned earlier about these specific like TA trainings about how do you support your students, all that, that's so amazing. Um, oh, I am so sorry. I'm like running over time, but I will make sure I get through this slide in the next 5 minutes. So another thing that I found was, again, isolation. It's not a new thing, but in particular, I'm not isolated from my classmates, from my course mates, because we have group chats going, we have things going on, but I felt isolated from other TAs. And because of that, it kind of added to that extra anxiety of how do I support my students? I don't know if what I'm doing is right. I don't know if, what I can do further. I know that pre-COVID, for the course that I'm leading, TAs would usually get together and they would have like kind of these grading parties where we would grade papers together, and so there's more community, there's more of that. So it's a lot more challenging right now with things being online, as how to kind of have a little bit more of that sense of community. uh, Work-life balance, always a challenge, whether it's virtual or not. But I find that these days I'm sitting at my desk for 10 hours, 11 hours, and I'm finding it really challenging because my workspace is my home space and there's not a lot of divide between the two. In the past, it would be I would commute to school and there's a definite endpoint in where my school life starts and where my personal life starts, but now it's just kind of like one big blur. um, Another thing I want to talk about is how research can be really isolating, and now that things are online, it's even more so. And what I mean by this is that I think even kind of pre-COVID, whenever you're working on your own thesis, working on your own research, that can be, you can feel really far away from your peers, whether that is like emotionally or like mentally or physically or any of those things. And I think things being online has really kind of taken that up a notch. So things like, writing boot camps or kind of write-a-thons that campuses have, that's something that's super helpful. And just generally, there's just more ambiguity. Things are a lot more up in the air this semester and this year, just in terms of where to go, what to look for, what to do, because we're all still struggling to kind of adapt to this new way of life. And a couple of last things I want to say is there's a bit of a lack of a collective identity with things being online more. Um, and what I mean by that is it's really kind of harder to identify yourself strongly or to feel that kind of like organizational identification of like, oh, I'm so proud of my program. I'm so proud of what I'm doing. Like I feel really involved with my school, really involved with my students, because just it sometimes can feel like everyone's doing their own thing. And lastly, about not knowing where to go for help. It's not just specific to kind of mental well-being, but I think of like help for all kinds of things, and especially in my case about help for how do I support other students. That is a little bit more ambiguous online, because I know that in person there were kind of specific departments or specific people that I could pop into. So with things being online, there's a lot more ambiguity of who do I reach out to if I have questions. So with that, I know that I've kind of dragged on for quite a bit. We're now at 2 o'clock, so I'm gonna end here, and we can maybe go to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much to all three of you. I thought that was really informative. Lots of great actionable, practical information, and very complementary topics were discussed. I will definitely dive into the first question we have, and it's from Jordan Berard. First of all, he says, thank you for your presentation. I am wondering if you have any strategies to increase enrollment and engagement during virtual wellness events, since all other academic commitments are online. How can we encourage students to make their mental health a priority on top of all of the other virtual commitments, and how Zoom fatigue is implicated in this? This is for anyone who wants to sort of take a first stab at it, but I'll let you guys decide.
I think that's a really good question, and I can really empathize with that because my campus has a lot of these mental health events, and I admittedly have been ignoring them. I did sign up for one on Friday, though, so it's something that, and I think that's really pertinent because I think Zoom fatigue and us just being really, we're signing up for multiple events, multiple seminars, all that, and it seems sort of silly and like counterproductive in a way that if I want to care about my mental health, I want to do self-care, I want to do my own thing, I don't want to jump on yet another seminar, yet another thing. So I don't have specific answers except that I'm reminded of something that someone mentioned on I'm on this like graduate teaching assistant forum, but somebody mentioned that they took part in a mental wellness event where they signed into the event, and the person said that we, for this entire event, all we're going to do is there's going to be no presentation, nobody's going to be speaking at you. What we're going to do is we're going to pick something that you enjoy doing, whether it was going to be like yoga or like dance or knitting, and we're just going to do that together for this whole hour, and there's going to be no presentation. And they said like that was amazing. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, kind of going off what Perlin said, I think integrating those kind of events into the curriculum, like sometimes class time. A lot of times we have presentations in class about writing, academic writing. And yesterday I had a presentation on PowerPoint presentations, but kind of prioritizing mental health and having those like within class time and making the time for it. I think it's really important. One of the things one of my professors does is she allocates the first 15 minutes of class, and we do breathing techniques and yoga. It's obviously optional, but I found that super helpful. Like I've never done it before, and I found myself really engaged in that, and the other students as well. So I think like one potential strategy is kind of integrating that into class time and making it a priority and things like that.
Yeah, and I follow up from the the faculty and staff side of things, I would say that, so one of the things that's in one of the purple guides I talked about is, guidelines for faculty to have conversations with their graduate students that they're mentoring and supervising as well. And so what I always go for is like a more formalized approach where you actually say, like, part of your professional development plan this year is self-care, and and then like have the faculty members say, like, these are the things that I'm trying right now, that we're in COVID and everything's strange, like, how are you doing? And it's actually part of the conversation as supervisors that you have with your graduate students. And that at the end, and that you actually record something at the end of the year, just like you say how many virtual conferences you presented at, and like how many publications you contributed to, and how many research objectives you made. Like, one of your actual objectives is also self-care. So when it's like that, and it just becomes, again, I'm all about the institutional culture change. So that's what I would say is a great idea, because then, to go back to your question, then you get that buy-in, because graduate students see that the people they admire, the people that they look up to, they want to be like, are doing it too, and also counted as just as important as everything else.
Those are all really great points. And one thing I'm thinking about is like intentional design to get people away from the screen. Like, we have to remember that when we are in different environments, we're not just staring at this screen all day. And now obviously that's our main medium of communication and communicating, requirements for the course. And maybe there's a way we can sort of include non-screen time, even if it's more conventional things like, hey, we're on a phone conference call, so you can sit and eat and we can all have dinner together and talk about things, stuff like that. One thing that really resonated with me with your presentation was this discussion of flexibility needs. And Perlin started off by talking about the life stage variance that exists, especially with graduate students. And just for full disclosure, I've been going through some graduate studies myself over the last couple of years. I'm also at a stage of my life in my 30s and married, and financial commitments like, a mortgage or realities. And there was a lot of planning that had to go in making the decision to do that. So I appreciate you bringing that up. One thing that, and I do some part-time teaching on the side, and a faculty member said to me when I was like earlier on and started my graduate studies, and it stuck with me. And he said, sometimes getting a B saves your sanity. And I've had to go back to that mentality way more often than I've wanted to in my graduate studies, where I'm just like, this is going to be one of those weeks where I have to be like, this is going to be just good enough. For example, this week I got assigned like 6 chapters of a textbook to read and empirically supported assignment due. And I was like, well, those are going to be probably 6 skim chapters of a textbook. I'm just curious if you guys have thoughts on practical ways that flexibility can be built into the graduate student experience, or on the flip side, awareness of potential barriers or reasons not to maybe go down the flexible route or hyper flexible route with building the graduate student experience.
So I'll start just again, okay, we all know everyone's perspective. Okay, so we used to have this thing called the TA training program, and it was like this 3-day boot camp, and you come all day and we just throw all this information at you about, TA training. And then when COVID happened, we decided to redesign it for the online environment. And it was actually a great thing, because then what we ended up doing is extending all those lessons out to a week. And then we didn't really, like, we put you in there on Monday, and then you were in the learning management system on Monday, and then you had until Friday to do all the things. And just having that flexibility of hours, when you want to do this kind of work, and to come back and look and say, okay, now I wanted to change my idea, and like review that video, and like watch it again with captions because you speak too quickly, like those kinds of things all really help students. And so we did the same thing with our program for international TAs. Sonia Ivanov did that one for communication in the Canadian classroom. So it used to be, you would come and you'd sit there for 2 hours and have the workshop. But what Sonia did was she turned it into like a full month with 1 week per module. So again, students have the flexibility to come and learn and review and do it again, or do it all in one day if they wanted. But we didn't actually check when they did it, as long as it was done. So that really helped.
Yeah, that sounds like a very reasonable solution for sure. So it's now 2:08 p.m. So before we sort of wrap things up, I'm just curious, for any of the three presenters, are there any final thoughts or thoughts on someone else's thoughts you want to comment on before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say, like, Chris, when you talked about the whole some weeks are going to be B weeks, the
Yeah.
thing that came to mind for me is somebody once said to me that in grad school you're being thrown a lot of balls, and at some point you're going to drop some of those balls. But the trick is to know which balls are made of glass and which balls are made of rubber.
Oh, I like that.
I love that. I love that because kind of this person went on to kind of say that the balls that are made of glass are your own health, your family, and your friends, but everything else is negotiable. So, just
Yeah,
end on that
that's
note.
that's beautiful. And I think that's something that maybe the communication can be sort of started to framed in that way. And I've definitely noticed that in year one of doing graduate studies, I had lack of awareness on a lot of those things. And now in year two, I'm like, okay, I can navigate and strategize on how to get through each week when I need to. So it's much more calm. Even when I look at a week where like, oh, 6 textbook chapters, huh? You know, so yeah, no, that's a really great metaphor or analogy, and I think I saw some collective smiles and nods when we heard that one. So thank you for sharing that, Perlin, and thank you to all three of you. Like that was an awesome presentation, and I think it's definitely going to get a lot of attention through our archived watching, and I hope we get to spread this around with lots of people because it was really, really helpful. So thank you again for preparing all of that and coming and delivering it and being very natural and open and honest about your perspectives.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for the opportunity to come in and talk about our experiences.
Great. Well, I hope everyone has a great day and enjoy the rest of your week.
Take care.